When a war produces over 1 million casualties on one side and the mainstream press still frames it as a stalemate, something is deeply structurally wrong with the information you're being given. Not slightly off, not editorially biased, fundamentally, deliberately, architecturally wrong. And today I want to walk you through exactly what that means. Because the number that dropped this week, Russia losing 1,050 troops in a single day, pushing the total claimed Ukrainian losses past 1.3 million, is not just a data point, it is a mirror. And what it reflects tells you more about the people presenting this information than it does about the battlefield itself. I want you to hold on to something I'm going to say right now, because we'll come back to it in the final part of this conversation, and it will reframe everything. The critical realization is this: the way a war is counted is the way a war is controlled. Whoever owns the numbers owns the narrative. And whoever owns the narrative decides, ultimately, who the public believes is winning, and more importantly, whether the public continues to consent to the cost of fighting it. Keep that in your mind as we go deeper, because by the time we unpack it fully, you will see the entire architecture of this conflict differently. So let's start at the surface and then go underneath it. The figure of 1.3 million Russian casualties, with over 1,000 losses reported in a single day, is coming from Ukrainian military sources, amplified through Western defense establishments, and repeated without serious interrogation by virtually every major media outlet in the United States. Now, I'm not asking you to simply disbelieve it. I'm asking you to apply the same skepticism to this number that you would apply to, say, a pharmaceutical company reporting its own clinical trial results. You would ask, who collected this data? What methodology was used? What incentive does the reporting party have? And critically, does this number cohere with the observable realities on the ground? Because here is where it starts to unravel. If Russia had genuinely lost 1.3 million troops, soldiers, the actual fighting force, in this conflict, we would be witnessing the largest military collapse in modern European history. We would be watching a nation hemorrhaging its male population at a rate that would make the Soviet losses of World War II look measured. Russia's military would not simply be degraded, it would be functionally non-existent. And yet, and I want you to sit with this contradiction, Russia is not only still fighting, it is, by virtually every independent military assessment, holding more Ukrainian territory today than it did 18 months ago. It is conducting complex multi-front operations, it is deploying new equipment, it is conscripting, yes, but it is not conscripting in the panicked, scraping the barrel way that a nation suffering 1.3 million real combat deaths would need to. Something does not add up, and when something doesn't add up in geopolitics, the first question is always, who benefits from the version of reality being sold? To understand why this matters beyond just the numbers, we have to look at what these casualty figures actually do, functionally, politically, psychologically, in the Western information ecosystem. Because they are not neutral data, they are deployed, they serve a purpose, and that purpose is to sustain the moral and political architecture that justifies continued Western military and financial support for Ukraine. Think about it from a pure strategic communication standpoint. If you are an administration in Washington or a defense ministry in London or Berlin, and you need your population to keep supporting a conflict that has now consumed hundreds of billions of dollars, you have a very particular narrative problem. You need the enemy to seem both threatening enough to justify the cost and weak enough that the cost seems worth it. You need Russia to be simultaneously powerful enough to fear and brittle enough to be on the verge of defeat. Inflated casualty numbers serve both functions beautifully. They say, look how much damage we're doing, the strategy is working, keep funding it, just a little more, we're almost there. Does that language sound familiar to you? I want to ask you something directly, and I genuinely want you to think about this in the comments. At what point does a military strategy that has been described as almost working for 3 consecutive years stop being a strategy and start being a fundraising mechanism? Because that is a serious question, and it deserves a serious answer from people paying attention. Now let's go one level deeper, because the casualty narrative is only one thread in a much larger fabric. To understand what's really happening in this conflict, we have to stop looking at Ukraine and Russia in isolation and start looking at the global power architecture that this war is embedded in. And when we do that, the picture shifts dramatically. This war did not begin in February 2022. That is the date of the most recent escalation, but the strategic groundwork, the expansion of NATO, the management of Ukrainian domestic politics, the positioning of military infrastructure, goes back at least to 2014, and in many analysts' view, much further. What we are watching is not a spontaneous territorial dispute. It is the most visible front in a decades-long structural contest over whether a unipolar American-led global order survives into the 21st century or whether a multipolar arrangement, one in which Russia, China, and the global South have genuine strategic agency, becomes the new architecture of international relations. And here is where the chessboard metaphor becomes genuinely useful, not as a cliché, but as a precise analytical tool. On a chessboard, pieces sacrifice themselves not because they are weak, but because their sacrifice advances the position of the player. The question you always have to ask in geopolitics is, which player is sacrificing which piece and toward what endgame? Because if you only watch the piece being sacrificed, you will misread the entire game. Right now, the Western media apparatus is focused almost entirely on the piece. The daily casualty count, the village taken, the village lost, the drone footage, the emotional human cost. And all of that is real. The human suffering is absolutely real. But the player moving those pieces is operating on a timeline and toward objectives that the daily news cycle is structurally incapable of capturing. And when you pull back to that level of analysis, the strategic picture looks very different from what you're being shown. Russia's strategic objective in this conflict was never simply to hold the Donbass, though that is certainly part of it. The deeper objective, and this is stated explicitly in Russian strategic doctrine, it is not a conspiracy theory, is to prevent Ukraine from becoming a military staging ground for NATO power projection onto Russian borders. That is the core security demand that Russia has articulated since at least 2008, when the NATO Bucharest summit declared that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. From Moscow's perspective, everything that has followed is a logical, if brutal, consequence of that declaration being treated as non-negotiable by Washington. Now, and I want to be very clear here, acknowledging that logic is not endorsing the invasion. The invasion has caused catastrophic, unjustifiable suffering for the Ukrainian people. Those are not mutually exclusive truths, but you cannot understand the strategic dynamics of this war if you refuse to engage with the logic of the party you've been told is simply evil. Evil is not a strategy, and Russia's behavior in this conflict, whatever you think of its morality, follows a coherent strategic logic that has been consistent and largely predictable for anyone watching carefully. So why does the United States establishment find it so difficult to acknowledge that logic? This is the question I want you to think about, and I'd genuinely like to hear your perspective in the comments, because I think the answer here is not simple and it implicates domestic American politics as much as it does foreign policy. Part of the answer is institutional. The foreign policy establishment in Washington, what some analysts call the blob, has a deep, almost structural aversion to acknowledging that adversarial states might have legitimate security interests, because to acknowledge that is to open a door to negotiation. And negotiation in the context of a conflict where enormous financial and industrial interests have developed around the continuation of that conflict is threatening to a very specific set of stakeholders: defense contractors, think tanks, political careers built on hawkishness. The revolving door between government and the arms industry is not a metaphor. It is a documented, quantifiable reality, and it creates a constituency that is, at its core, economically aligned with the perpetuation of conflict rather than its resolution. But to understand why this particular conflict has become so central to that dynamic, we have to look at the economic and monetary dimensions that almost never get discussed on mainstream television. Because this war is not only a military confrontation, it is also a battle over the future of the global financial architecture. The sanctions regime imposed on Russia following February 2022 was the most sweeping in modern history. It was designed explicitly to collapse the Russian economy within months. The ruble was going to become rubble, as one prominent Western leader famously predicted. And what happened? The Russian economy contracted, yes, briefly, and then it adapted. Russia pivoted its trade relationships toward China, India, Iran, and the broader global South with a speed and depth that genuinely surprised Western economists. The ruble stabilized. Russia's current account surplus actually increased in the first year of the war, partly due to elevated energy prices. And perhaps most significantly, and this is the thread that connects to something much larger, the weaponization of the dollar through sanctions has accelerated a global conversation about de-dollarization that would have seemed marginal even 5 years ago. Think about what that means structurally. The United States dollar's reserve currency status is not simply an economic fact, it is the foundational pillar of American geopolitical power. It is what allows Washington to run persistent deficits, to finance its military globally, to impose financial punishment on adversaries without firing a shot. When the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now a growing list of others, begin seriously discussing alternative payment systems, alternative reserve assets, alternative trade settlement mechanisms, they are not just talking about economics. They are talking about dismantling the material basis of American hegemony. And the fact that this conversation has moved from the margins to the center of global economic diplomacy is, in my view, one of the most consequential geopolitical developments of the last half-century. And it is almost entirely absent from the American mainstream media's coverage of this war. Ask yourself why. I want to pose a question to the Americans watching this, and I want you to be honest with yourself. When was the last time a major American news network dedicated a serious analytical segment to explaining the BRICS expansion, the petrodollar's fragility, or the relationship between NATO expansion and dollar hegemony? When was the last time the economic incentive structures of the people delivering you the Ukraine narrative were examined on the same programs that deliver you that narrative? If your answer is never or rarely, then you already understand intuitively what I'm describing. The information architecture is not designed to inform, it is designed to manage, and there is a difference. Now let me come back to something I raised earlier, the question of what is actually happening on the battlefield. Because I don't want to get so deep into the structural analysis that we lose sight of the human and military reality. The ground situation in eastern Ukraine is genuinely brutal, genuinely complex, and genuinely different from what the casualty inflation narrative suggests. Russian forces have made grinding but consistent advances in the Donbas over the past year. The town of Avdiivka fell. Pressure along multiple sections of the front line has been sustained. Ukraine's counteroffensive of 2023, which was presented to the Western public with considerable fanfare, new equipment, Western training, the moment of reversal, produced minimal territorial gains at enormous human and material cost. That is not a pro-Russian talking point. That is the assessment of Western military analysts, including some who are strongly sympathetic to Ukraine's cause. The gap between the public narrative and the military reality has been widening for some time, and this is where the casualty figures serve their second, perhaps more important function. Because if the counteroffensive failed, and it did, then the public needs an explanation that doesn't implicate the strategy itself. The explanation provided is, we are inflicting unsustainable losses on Russia. Russia is running out of men. Russia is running out of equipment. Russia's military is being destroyed even as it advances. It is a peculiar kind of victory framing. We are losing ground, but they are losing more men, and it has been remarkably effective at sustaining public and political support in Western Europe and, to a lesser degree, in the United States. But the arithmetic, when examined seriously, does not hold. Military analysts who have attempted to reconstruct Russian order of battle, the actual deployment of units, the observed force structure, do not see an army that has lost 1.3 million personnel. They see an army that has taken significant losses, that has adapted its tactics under pressure, and that is, by current assessment, larger in active deployment than it was at the start of the conflict. That is not the profile of a force that has been attritionally destroyed. So here we arrive at the critical realization I asked you to hold from the very beginning of this conversation, and now I want to unpack it fully. The way a war is counted is the way a war is controlled. What does that mean in practice? It means that the statistical representation of a conflict is not a neutral act, it is a political act. Every number, casualties, territorial control, equipment losses, is produced by someone with a stake in the outcome. Ukraine has an obvious and understandable interest in presenting Russian losses as catastrophic because doing so sustains Western support. Western governments have an interest in validating those numbers because doing so justifies the policy they have already committed to. Western media has an interest in amplifying those numbers because it aligns with the editorial framework within which they have been covering this conflict since its beginning. The entire information ecosystem around this war is structured to produce and reinforce a specific conclusion. And that conclusion, Russia is losing, the strategy is working, stay the course, happens to align perfectly with the institutional, financial, and political interests of the people most loudly repeating it. Now here is what makes this genuinely dangerous, not just analytically interesting, but consequentially dangerous. When a population is systematically misinformed about the state of a conflict, it loses its ability to make rational democratic judgments about that conflict. If the American public genuinely believed, because they had been given accurate information, that 3 years of Western support had not achieved the strategic objectives promised, that the battlefield situation is grinding and unresolved, that Russia is not on the verge of collapse, and that the path forward involves either genuine diplomatic engagement or an indefinite and escalating commitment with nuclear-armed state. If they believed all of that accurately, they might make different political choices. They might demand different policies, and that, I suspect, is precisely why they are not being given that accurate picture. The global morality dimension of this conflict is something I want to address directly, because it tends to get flattened into a simple framework: democracy versus autocracy, freedom versus oppression, that is not only intellectually dishonest, but strategically paralyzing. The United States, in the same period that it has framed this conflict as a defense of international norms and sovereignty, has continued to provide military support to governments engaged in documented violations of those same norms in other theaters. The moral framework being applied to Russia is not a universal framework consistently applied. It is a selective framework, and its selectivity tells you something important about its actual purpose. I'm not saying this to provide cover for Russian actions in Ukraine. I'm saying it because a foreign policy built on moral rhetoric that isn't universally applied will eventually lose its credibility, and it is losing it rapidly across the global south, where the memory of Western interventions in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, and elsewhere is not abstract history. It is lived experience. And this is where the deepest strategic irony of this entire conflict lies. The United States entered this confrontation with Russia with enormous structural advantages: financial, military, institutional, alliance-based, and yet, 3 years in, the strategic outcome most feared by Washington's foreign policy establishment, the consolidation of a Russia-China-led multipolar bloc, the erosion of dollar dominance, the fracturing of the Western-led international order, is more advanced than it was before the conflict began. The sanctions didn't collapse Russia. They accelerated the construction of alternative financial architecture. The isolation didn't isolate Russia. It demonstrated to the global south that the Western-led order is willing to weaponize economic interdependence, which made non-Western alternatives more attractive. The military strategy hasn't defeated Russia. It has consumed Ukrainian manpower and Western stockpiles, while Russia has restructured its defense industrial base for sustained production. By almost every strategic metric that matters at the systemic level, the policy has produced outcomes opposite to its stated intentions. I'll leave you with this final thought, and I want to hear what you make of it. Great powers throughout history have had a remarkably consistent blind spot. They tend to mistake the map for the territory, the narrative for the reality, the number on the briefing slide for the truth on the ground. The United States is not uniquely susceptible to this failure, but it is currently exhibiting it in a form that is unusually visible to those willing to look. The 1.3 million figure, the 1,050 in a day, these numbers are not just statistics. They are symptoms of an information environment that has been so thoroughly managed for so long in service of a strategy that is not working, that the managers themselves may no longer be able to distinguish the map from the territory, and that historically is the point at which the most catastrophic miscalculations tend to occur. So watch carefully, read widely, and whatever you do, don't let anyone count this war for you without asking who's doing the counting and why.